Our second scripture reading of the day comes to us from the book of Exodus. Hear the story of the enslaved Israelites under the rule of Pharaoh. No straw is given to your servants, yet they say to us, "Make bricks." Look how your servants are beaten. You are unjust to your own people. He said, "You are lazy, lazy. That is why you say, 'Let us go and sacrifice to the Lord.' Go now and work, for no straw shall be given to you, but you shall still deliver the same number of bricks." The Israelite supervisors saw that they were in trouble when they were told, "You shall not lessen your daily number of bricks." As they left Pharaoh, they came upon Moses and Aaron, who were waiting to meet them. They said to them, "The Lord look upon you and judge. You have brought us into bad odor with Pharaoh and his officials, and have put a sword in their hand to kill us." Then Moses turned again to the Lord and said, "O Lord, why have you mistreated this people? Why did you ever send me? Since I first came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has mistreated this people. And when you have done nothing at all to deliver your people." Then the Lord said to Moses, "You shall see what I will do to Pharaoh. Indeed, by a mighty hand he will let them go. By a mighty hand he will drive them out of his land." The word of the Lord.
Well, in this month of February, we are exploring this concept of thin places. And you remember thin places are where heaven and earth meet, sort of in a way where it seems much more transparent. And last week we talked about wilderness as a place of sort of an awareness and heightened sense that we can sometimes have of God. And during the rest of this series, we're going to be looking at some places like mountains. Mountaintops are a great place where people describe them as thin places. Or in the Bible, they also talk about rivers as a place where it seems like the spirit and the human meet together in some sort of special way. But today I'm not going to talk about a location as much as I'm going to talk about periods in our lives that are often marred by testing or tribulations as a biblical world, or trials, or just really hard stuff. You know, it's an interesting, amazing thing, but as much as we try to avoid it, none of us get a free pass from having struggles. None of us do. At some point, sooner or later, something's going to hit you that was unexpected. Something's going to come into your life that totally is disruptive. There's going to be times where it might have been your fault or someone else's fault, but let me guarantee you, we're going to have them. There's no way around it. No one lives a life that's perfectly smooth and on an upward trajectory until the moment of their last breath. It just isn't our human experience. And yet it's interesting that those times of testing or trouble or tribulation or struggle are sometimes invitations in our lives to have some of the most intimate and remarkable relationship moments with God. They're moments that sort of can open us up and actually expose for us a thin place in the midst of that struggle where we feel a greater sense of God's love or God's purpose or God's care. You know, it's interesting, the Bible is full of these kinds of stories. In fact, if you just open the pages of the Bible, page after page, chapter after chapter, book after book, are really about the stories of God's people being in times of testing. So let's think about the first one, right? The first test or trial is the trial of obedience with Adam and Eve. Okay, move forward a little bit, and we have the great story of Abraham and Sarah. And they have to endure this sort of tribulation and trial of patience, right? They're struggling with infertility. They've had these great promises. And then they're told, or with no evidence of that promise being met, of waiting. They end up being in that space of a trial of deep patience. Or the story that we heard today that Calvin read for us, that's part of the larger story of the Exodus, where Pharaoh just outraged at the people of God insisting that they have a chance to go out to the wilderness to worship. He exacts an even greater cost on them, and the injustice is overwhelming. And they, as a people, are tested by the trial of injustice. How will this get turned around? How will they find their way when the oppression is so severe? Stories all throughout the Old Testament go back and forth, and we could track all of those, but let's look at a few New Testament ones. We heard the story of Jesus going out into the wilderness, and we know that story. It's right after his baptism. He's actually given the test of faith, isn't he? He's out in the wilderness with no provisions, and there's tests that test his sense of power, his sense of hunger, his sense of resolve. And that really is a test of faith that happens in his life. Or what about Peter, one of Jesus' favorite disciples, right? Peter, at the time of Jesus' trial and his eventual execution, is really given the test of love, isn't he? Does he love Jesus enough? And we see that sort of coming into conclusion at the end of the book of John, where we see after the resurrection, Jesus and Peter have a sweet conversation by the Sea of Galilee. And then what about the great Apostle Paul? You know, the Apostle Paul, it says, was lashed 40 times minus one, which is just a way of saying he was beaten nearly to death. He was stoned. Imagine that you survived a stoning. That's a pretty severe form of punishment. He was arrested. He was beaten. He was shipwrecked. He was bitten by a viper. And we almost see in Paul's life this test of endurance. I mean, there are times when I read his story and I think, really, can anything worse happen to that guy? And can he actually keep his head up and stand up? So the Bible is full of these remarkable stories of testing, and they echo our own. And that's why, in many ways, we love reading the stories of the Bible, because we find ourselves relating to various characters. But I dare say in the stories that I just mentioned, they're actually kind of like these heroes of faith, right? And what often happens is that God speaks to them with an audible voice. They sort of get the letter we've all been waiting for, the email in our inbox we wish we had from God. Here's my message. Here's my direction to you. Here's my assurance. Or we have some sort of miraculous sort of exhibit of God's power. I mean, if the Israelites in the desert had any doubt about God's power, it's that story of the sea actually being parted. And what happens to the enemies? They all end up being drowned in the waters. It's like they get retribution and justice all in one little miracle. But I dare say that most of us don't have those kinds of miracles that happen. At least I haven't. How many of you have had sort of God's signature handwriting in the sky? Or have had that audible voice of God, or some great demonstration of power? Most of us have to figure out how to navigate these trials and tribulations in a very different way. And there are some of us, like the stories we just heard, who seem to have superhuman sort of resilience in the face of great trials. They just seem to, like, you think about Paul or Jesus, they just sort of step up and they just are able to trust God in the face of unbelievably horrible circumstances. But then we have some of those other people that are just kind of meh. They sort of believe, sort of don't. They're sort of more like us. They kind of give and take in that whole, how do we see God in the midst of our trial situation? And I think Peter's a great example of that, right? He's just a normal human being who caught up in the circumstances and his own passions and his own ways of seeing the world, where he sort of has that uneven, sort of bumpy road. But he eventually gets to that place where he has this strong and enduring faith. But then, really, at the very beginning of the story, and we heard it in the reading from Exodus, some people in the midst of trials are utterly crushed. And the people of Israel, make no mistake, the injustice that they suffered was crushing and terrible. And they cry out against their leaders, in this case, Moses and Aaron. And then Moses and Aaron, crushed by the crushing criticism of the people that they're leading, cry out to God. And even with all the signs of miraculous power, even the provision of God's pillar of light that leads the Israelites by night and shows them the way, even how God provides food for them every day with manna, the people of God, it takes decades for them to trust and find. They're crushed by the oppression. They're crushed by what they see as God's unfaithfulness to them. And you know, all of us experience trials in these same ways. There are times when we seem to draw on some sort of superhuman resilience that we have inside of us. Other times where it's, I don't know, kind of on that teeter-totter of faith and disbelief. And then there are moments when it's just so crushing. Now, while we may not have that skywriting from God that many of us don't have, there are times when in the midst of extreme crisis and pain, the presence of God is just sweet and ever present. I was thinking about a friend of mine whose husband died prematurely. He died of a heart attack playing basketball, his favorite thing. And one day she had this vibrant, athletic husband in their 40s, and the next day he was gone. And she talked about how intense the grief was. In fact, in that season, she almost withdrew from everything. The only thing she did was go to work and functioned only there, but at home she withdrew, and the grief was so overwhelming. She didn't go to church. She didn't reach out to her friends. In fact, if you were a friend, of which I was at the time, and tried to reach out to her, she blew you off. It was just so painful that she didn't want to talk about it, but she had to face it in her own sort of private way at home. And when she sort of came out of that season, I asked her about her faith and what sustained her, because she came out of that season of great struggle and trial and grief, a really strong, resilient Christian. And she said, it was this interesting thing. For as intense as the pain was, God was right there. She said, every moment I cried out in my grief and my just utter devastation, I was aware that Christ was right there weeping with me, crying with me. And she said, I have never had such an intense experience of God's presence, except in the darkest moment of my life. It was really a stunning sort of reminder that in the midst of really very painful and difficult struggles, there are some of us that find that support, maybe not from handwriting in the sky or a sign of miraculous presence or power of God, but in that quiet, simply heartbreaking vulnerability that somehow we experience God in those moments, in that intersection of deep pain. But for many of us, that's still even not our story. And in those moments of trial and testing, the thin places where we come to recognize where God is present often comes through the very people of God. It's an amazing thing that in the 12-step movement in this country, it was people gathered together around the tragedy of addiction, that through the understanding of support and walking with people who had walked the journey that they had walked, that people found the strength within. They discovered new forms of spirituality. They developed a resilience in the face of their addiction because of the support of the community. And out of that has spawned a whole movement of support groups. When you have cancer, you're often invited into a support group, or whether it's online or in person, of other people who've walked that journey. How many people in the times of grieving or illness or tragedy or struggles with their children or having disabilities or whatever the whole thing is, where do they look to? Where's the recommendation from the medical field or the mental health field? Find some other people to be in support, to be in community. And I would say that in this Christian faith, we have the most amazing invitation of being the body of Christ. Oftentimes, the most thin place where we discover God is in the love that's extended to us, the care that is given to us when we move through those times of trial and testing, of struggle, of tribulation. It's when the people of God who have been on a similar journey step into that place and hold us and care for us, not judging us, not insisting that we're faithful, but being almost faithful on our behalf, holding the person and their circumstances and bringing them before God. It's that act of intercession and care that is so powerful. And often in the times of testing, it is the thin place where the people of God show up, and they are the thin place. they become the evidence that God is actually alive and at work in the world, because the people who are struggling see it in the people of God's hearts and in their generosity. When I think about the Apostle Paul and I think about the many writings that we have, we see evidence of that. Paul says in 2 Corinthians, he writes it this way. He said, "We are afflicted in every way, but we're not crushed. We are driven to despair, persecuted, but we're not forsaken. We're struck down, but not destroyed." And Paul, when he talks in this language of the endurance and the trials that he's had to endure, he speaks about the people of God and the churches in the early years of the church who prayed for him. It was that supportive presence. It was also the presence of his co-workers, who I'm sure had to buoy one another up in those moments of great pain. Remember, it's Paul and Silas who are in prison in Philippi. They've been beaten to just the inches of their lives, and yet it says they were singing and worshiping late at night within the prison. And it's out of that a tremendous witness to the power of God becomes evident. When I think about that people of God and the thin places that we can be for one another, that we can allow heaven and earth to be more recognizable, it's in the grace that we extend to one another. You know, today we're having our annual meeting, and we're going to be celebrating and remembering the things of God's faithfulness for the last year. And I was thinking about it, these four sort of pillars of our church. They're about care, right? They're about our willingness to step in and care for those who are in trying circumstances. But then I'm thinking, sometimes in those trying circumstances, it's in the conversations that we have and the real nitty-gritty of talking through and sort of exposing our false beliefs that happen in times of trial and getting clear on what is really true and what really matters. Or I think about the nature of worship that our Celebrate ministries that are really about that core of resetting every week around what the most important thing is. Because you see, in times of trial, all the junk gets moved away, and the things that are most important become clear. And worship is one of those things that can help reorient us, ground us, feed us, and equip us to move out into the world. But then I think about how many times in our times of testing and trial is when we actually get out of our own problems and our own selves and we do something for the sake of someone else. Thinking about our serve ministries here that can sort of catalyze and change us from the inside. It's that caring, it's that learning, it's that serving, it's that celebrating that become the places where the community in all those multifaceted ways extends the grace and care and love of God. It makes it more tangible, more concrete, more visible. And whether those people is a group of people, like the many in our community that benefit from our efforts to feed and deal with the issues of food scarcity, or whether it's someone sitting in a care center who has someone bring them communion and share the grace and love of God, all throughout that are the ways that we as the people of God become the thin places in those times of testing for others. As a church, I have to say that as I think back on 2019, for me, when I think about 2018 and part of the year of 17 when I came, the thing that strikes me the most is that this is a church that went through a tremendous time of testing, but what kept us together was that strong core faithfulness that God was present. But even more importantly, it was the love that you have for one another. The ability to encourage one another when it was tough. The care and love that you extended to one another when it was painful, when the grief was insurmountable, particularly when LP was sick and passed. When things were disrupted and things didn't make sense, even the welcoming of new leadership and new ways of being, it's that community that draws us together, keeps us together, and points us to Christ. There's no greater thing for us to celebrate today as we look back on 2019. And there's no greater promise that we need to live into, to actually be the people of God for one another. For there will be more testing ahead for us, whether individually, as a country, or as a church. And yet it is that presence of God and the promise of God's people being with us that make testing not something we need to be afraid of, but a thin place that we can enter into. Amen.